recorded.
Okay.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. At Derbyshire County Council, we don't have full compatibility with Zoom. We're allowed to use it, but we don't have the full package of measures. So hopefully you can now see my screen. So wide-scale retrofit of Derbyshire homes. So a little bit of background, I think most of you are already familiar with, but just to get us thinking and talking from the same page. So in October last year, we approved a climate change strategy looking at how we might achieve net zero, focusing on reducing emissions, not adapting to a changing climate, which will come later, slightly later. Within this strategy, there were 5 key areas of focus of the work. One of which is decarbonising the domestic sector. And within that climate change strategy, there were a number of targets, and I've just listed 3 here because they are of relevance to what I want to talk about tonight. So that all this relates to decarbonising existing homes. It's not about new build homes at all. There's some different targets for that. So the targets are that all existing owner-occupier domestic properties are EPC rated C or above by 2035. Secondly, all owner-occupiers and renters are to have access to education and training programmes to decarbonise their homes by 2025. And then finally, at least 20% of domestic buildings to have photovoltaic cells installed by 2030. So there's some interesting targets there, bearing in mind that the local authority doesn't actually have any statutory responsibilities for housing. So in some ways, housing is quite a new venture for Derbyshire County Council because the boroughs and districts are the housing or authorities for the area. So that's quite a departure. But in fact, no authority, no council has statutory responsibility for owner occupiers. So this is something quite different for us. Following on from those targets, there are a series of 3 different actions. And I'm sorry these are quite long, but I think they all tie into where we are, the things that we have been informally discussing. So the first action is about coordinated action. So through the Vision Derbyshire process, agree the approach to supporting the decarbonising of homes, recognising the specific opportunities and challenges faced by renters and homeowners, and reflecting the need to particularly support those in fuel poverty. And I will come back to these in a minute, but just to explain that Vision Derbyshire is a programme of all the local authorities in Derbyshire, or most, I should say, most of the local authorities in Derbyshire working together to take a unified approach to certain things, and climate change is one of those things. So there's a programme of actions around that. The second action, which neatly, again, it covers what Azizi and I have talked about covering this evening, is about skills and training. And that says that work with local authority and wider government partners to develop a regional skills strategy that identify areas of upskilling within the house building and retrofit sectors, and creates investor-ready training programmes to receive support from the proposed National Skills Fund. So again, I will talk about the actions we're taken to deliver that action from the climate change strategy later on. And then the final action relating to homeowners decarbonising their homes is education and empowerment, and developing an information sharing campaign to educate homeowners and renters on how to improve the energy efficiency of their property. And there is some overlap, obviously, with the first action there. So I think these actions do summarise where we're heading. So to achieve those, there are various things that have already actually happened or have been happening. So the district and borough councils have been working with Midlands Energy Hub and other agencies to secure central government funding to retrofit social housing and the homes of those in fuel poverty. So that's things like LAD funding, local area delivery funding, which you may or may not be familiar with, but that's definitely targeted on those in social housing and a small number of people who are in fuel poverty, and that's not really taking into account the recent increase in energy prices that have actually pushed a significant proportion of more people into fuel poverty. And again, I'm not really going to refer to any of that work with social housing or people in fuel poverty again, because that's sort of covered. There's other actions that are helping. So Simon's here from Marches Energy Agency, and they've been running the Warmer Derby and Derbyshire helpline, where people can phone up and get some energy advice, and indeed auditing and so on, and some small measures to help deliver energy efficiency measures. And a third strand to this work is that Derbyshire County Council has, for a number of years, run a healthy home project for those in fuel poverty and with a health issue that is impacted by cold weather. And that focuses on a really small portion of our society, and the project is very much aimed at keeping those people out of hospital. So it's funded through our Better Care Fund, which aims to basically improve public health. And again, we won't talk about those again, but none of these programs really tackle what about homeowners not in fuel poverty, although I have to say, Simon, your helpline does help everybody, regardless of whether they're in fuel poverty. So I'm now going to introduce a whole range of different things. And so bear with me until I get to the end, and there will be an opportunity to talk, to ask questions and discuss this. So owner occupiers, I'd like to talk about what we rather bizarrely call the able to pay, and also homeowners who aren't able to pay. So I'd like to focus on that sort of segment of community moving forward. So recently we produced a climate change community engagement plan, which I know I've spoken to a number of you about before, which set out how we plan to engage our communities in the sort of climate agenda. And what we set out in that is that we would like to engage communities on specific actions within our climate change strategy, rather than doing a sort of a more, what I might term a traditional citizens assembly, where we'd talk about the impacts of climate change, the science of climate change, what options were available, and then come up with a list of actions, which are often very generalized actions. We wanted to get right down to the nitty-gritty specifics about how we were going to tackle these things. So one of those projects, the first major project that we want to engage our communities on, is the decarbonisation of homes for the owner-occupied, very specific sector, although large sector of society. And to this end, one of the things that we've actually recently done is we applied to be part of a programme called the Local Climate Engagement Programme, run by UK 100 in partnership with, in our instance, Democratic Society and Shared Future. So we're going to be working with those organisations to develop an engagement plan. So all officers from all the different local authorities, if they wish to attend, will receive some training to help us engage with communities, to develop a plan with communities, understanding what they want to help them decarbonise their homes. So how can we help you decarbonise your homes? What do you need to decarbonise your home? And it's also to establish this sort of long-term vision and plan for decarbonising the county's housing, because of course, you know, this is not a 1 year or a 2 year or even a 5 year project, if you like. This is really realistically a 30-year plan. You know, there's no way we can decarbonise all the homes, the 340,000 homes in Derbyshire in 3, 5 or even 10 years, much as we would like to. So we are talking about a 30-year programme here. So it will certainly evolve over time. So the areas of focus are on skills and training, and there's various different things that have actually happened in the area of skills and training. So one of the things that we're very aware of, particularly, and it's come to the fore from a number of sources, so not least through the social housing decarbonisation schemes, is that there's actually a shortage of qualified, trained and experienced tradespeople to retrofit homes. So there are an increasing number of qualified tradespeople, and there's programs to get people qualified, but there's nothing like experience on the ground, as I'm sure you'll all agree. So the energy hubs, including Midlands Energy Hub, but the energy hubs across England have delivered some Green Homes Grant skills training, and they've trained up, and I'm just going to go onto a different screen now to get the figures for that. So just bear with me. So through that, they secured £6.9 million of money, and they worked with 17 training providers across England to upskill retrofit supply chain. And 6,938 training courses were completed. So that's a lot of qualified people. So, and 285 organisations were supported for either the PASS 2035 or the micro-certification scheme accreditation. And that programme has now been concluded, and the results are very much being evaluated. So that included sort of developing skills for retrofit assessors and coordinators, insulation, non-insulation fabric measures, heat pumps, solar thermal heating and hot water controls. A further strand of work to push forward that skills and training in that retrofit area is from Derbyshire County Council's Green Entrepreneur Scholarship Fund, and we have up to £100,000 available for existing tradespeople or even not existing tradespeople to apply for a small grant, say £1,500, to undergo particular training. And for instance, a friend of mine got £1,500. He's a plumber, he's been a plumber for a number of years, and he's retraining to fit air source heat pumps, and he's got funding for that. So it's for that kind of thing, and it's a really, really simple application process. So if you know any plumbers or electricians or whatever that want to, or anybody else that's in the building trade that would like a scholarship to go on a short course, then that funding, we would like to see more people apply to that. In addition, Vision Derbyshire, this local authority wide programme in Derbyshire, is looking at sustainability and green skills, and that's a key part. There's been a certain amount of work undergone to understand what skills and training is required. Now, a lot of that focuses on alternative energy sources and on, let me think what the other, and installing certain energy measures rather than retraining trades, but they are turning their attention now onto understanding what more skills and experience and etc. are needed by the retrofit tradespeople. So there's a lot of work going on to understand, to build those skills and training to ensure we have that supply chain in place, so that if we, hopefully when we see increased numbers of people wanting to retrofit their homes, we are able to find the tradespeople we actually need, who are qualified and hopefully experienced. I think a final thing that needs covering on the first section of my talk is the quality assurance. Because we all want, I know from my own personal experience, we want to know that if something goes wrong, there's some sort of system or some backup, or you know that the tradesperson you're employing is qualified and experienced, because I know probably a lot of us here have been guinea pigs for certain technologies and they've not always worked smoothly. So what quality assurance is there for the homeowner to invest what is probably going to be an awful lot of money of their life savings and so on and so forth to upgrade their home? So we are talking about some sort of quality assurance scheme. The phrase trusted trader plus has been quoted, but that this is really in the early days. But we'd like to understand from our communities what they would like to see, rather than us imposing something top down and getting it wrong. And I think that's the end of, no, the next bit. So helps and hinders in this training, on the training of retrofit trades. So hinders. There's a lack of capacity within all the local councils. So boroughs and districts are absolutely pulled out with the social housing and fuel poverty schemes. And we're absolutely pulled out, although I'm pleased to say our 2 project officers will be starting work next month. So I'm absolutely delighted about that. I don't think they know what's going to hit them actually, but there we go. Housing's not a statutory role for the county, and the boroughs and the districts definitely focus on social housing and those in fuel poverty. So it's a bit of a new area for the councils, and that can be quite scary and daunting. And I suppose there's also a discussion about whether it should be our responsibility. And I think another hindrance is the perceived lack of resources. And by that, I mean funding to kickstart this, but we'll come back to that at the end of this evening's talk. And I say perceived lack because I'm not sure it is actually a lack in reality in some ways. Things that help though, we now have the climate change strategy, which provides us with a very clear direction and some clear actions that have been approved, so we can move forward on that. But I think what's also going to be a help is the need to develop this shared understanding of what that challenge is. And I think that's where you come in to help us understand what that challenge is. You know, what is needed? What's your role? What's our role? How can we all work together more effectively? And at that point, Zizi, I think I'm going to end just there, ready for the first bit of discussion. So I think if I stop sharing, cancel. I think hopefully I've now stopped sharing, am I right?
Yes, you have. And so that's great because I can now see everybody's faces. If you'd like to ask a question, and you go down to something called reactions, and you click on that, the bottom reaction is called raise hand, and that's the best way. Although if you need to, Joan, are you raising your hand manually?
No, I've done it technologically, if that's the right word. I think that's a word. Yeah, it's well, you've probably already taken this on board, but as I understand it, a key skill that's required is the task of the assessor, who actually goes in and identifies what works need to be done and makes sure that the order that they've done in is successful, and that you're not doing, the builder isn't doing something that will cause problems in the
Yeah,
future. So I expect that you already covered that. It's just that you didn't specifically mention it in terms of trade.
Part of the so within the training that the energy hubs delivered, assessors were part of that. But I think for me, it's really important that those assessors are really experienced and know their onions. I wouldn't like to have an inexperienced assessor assessing my own home. So I think you're absolutely right. The assessor is paramount.
And there is amongst, I think it's architects and building surveyors, have grasped that climate change is happening and looking at to think about if they have the relevant skills of knowledge of buildings to then add on, the retrofit would be relatively easy. And so I understand that those professions specifically are looking to see if they can encourage some of their members to get the specific training, which would give us confidence because, as you say, they will have the other building experience. But how many people actually take that up? And presumably there'll be people coming from other places that think this is important or this is an area I want to get into and won't necessarily have that background. But yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Joan, and thanks, Denise. Anybody else got a question? Robin, you'll need to unmute.
Yeah, I have.
Thank you.
So I have a question, which is my interpretation of this is that the assessor is fundamental in like a keystone or a linchpin on the whole process. So how many assessors do you need for Derbyshire, and how many have you got? Has anyone done that piece of work?
No, so we haven't. We've got a little tune going on. No, we haven't really got that far. I would have to ask. I'm not sure how many there are in the county or surrounding counties. You can actually go to I'm trying to remember what website it is. You can find that out. But how many do we need? We don't know. And I think that's part of the process that we now want to undergo, is to really understand what the scale of this is and what's the appetite for action. So, how many homeowners each month will want to go through this process, and how might that change over the first year, the second year, and the fifth year, and so on. And I think for me, the way this appears to be developing is that this early phase, this early next phase, is going to be working with homeowners who I might classify as early adopters of new technology, not the innovators, the ones who've, really gone out and tried something brand new for whatever reason, whatever their motivation is. This is the ones that are sort of coming after the innovators, but not that they're coming before the main body of people do that work. So still testing things and developing things and so on. So it's trying to anticipate what that growth curve might be in the future. And I think we need to work with communities to understand what that appetite might be, and then understand the numbers.
Yes, it's hard to tell at this stage. And another key role, as well as the assessors, is the retrofit coordinator, which in some cases is going to be the person to take the assessment and then guide the homeowner, hold their hand all the way through the rest of the process. So if anything, I think that might be a bigger role. But I've got Mike and then Michael. And then after those two people, I'll move on to the next section of your talk, Denise. So Mike, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering really about the level of advice and support that is given. Is it to get them up to level C, or is it utopia to get them up to an A? So in terms of the advice that's given, is it, you know, is not to get into passive house standard, but to a good enough standard? Is that the idea? Because, you know, to get to the ultimate might be way out of the budget for most people. So I just wonder what the practical levels are that they, in terms of advice that they give.
Yeah, and I again, I think that will vary according to the homeowner, because I can say with 99.9% certainty that the council won't be providing funding for homeowners to retrofit their homes. It will be up to homeowners to provide the funding to retrofit their own home, or we'll come on to funding later. So actually, I think it's not about what we're aiming for, although, you know, we'd like to aim for the utopia. I think it's about understanding what the homeowner, when that assessment goes in, understanding what the homeowner can afford or what their priorities are, and getting the best advice for that.
And it's going to depend on all sorts of things, like the age of their building. It's much harder to get up to passive house standard if you're in a 100-year-old building than if you're in a 20-year-old building and things. Anyway, Michael, what's your question?
Thank you. Good evening, engineers. Very roughly speaking, and correct me if I'm way off, about 10% of the stock is in the social rented sector. About 15% will be in the private rented sector, and the other 75% privately owned and occupied. Legislation or existing commitments will cover the social rented sector and the landlord sector, because they will be obliged to achieve certain standards by a defined date. Given that a lot of the capacity for retrofit will be taken up by those sectors being dealt with, it might leave very little capacity for the private rented sector. So if we are to develop a scheme which is intended to support and take through the private rented, the privately owned sector through the process, isn't it likely that ability to undertake the work is going to be a very severe rate limiting process? And if that's the case, do we not have a real crisis here? Because we don't have 30 years. And indeed, I think one of your opening slides indicated that that was the case, because you had set, excuse me, somebody's trying to reach me. Go on. That you have set yourself objectives to achieve by 2035 a very high level of achievement. And indeed, that is necessary, because the UK's commitment, its nationally determined contribution and its sixth carbon budget will require a much more rapid level of decarbonation than the notion that we've got 30 years to deal with it. So to what extent can any scheme that we devise be proactive, in other words, encouraging homeowners to do what's necessary, when we know there isn't the capacity to provide for them?
Really tough question, because I don't have the answer to that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a number of things there. I think if I'm having an optimistic day, I like to think that over the next 2 to 5 years, we're building that capacity. And if we think about that product adoption curve, that sort of goes exponentially anyway. I mean, it's a bell-shaped curve, but actually, if you're thinking about numbers that have completed something, that would sort of fit in with that overall S-shaped curve that we want for the speed of decarbonisation. And we would hope that the number of trades available would increase to fulfill that. And also we need to think about that supply chain for goods and equipment and so on, that they are being manufactured as well, you know. So it's, and also there's this sort of global situation in terms of, can we get parts, can we get materials to actually produce the things that we need to retrofit our homes with. So I think there's loads and loads of questions there, and if I think about it too much, then it is a little bit overwhelming, because I honestly think, how on earth are we ever going to achieve this in the timescales that we need? And I think it's a really good question. But I think we do have to look at the figures, and I think we need to understand the problem from a number of different perspectives. Like, how many people would be willing to retrofit their home in the first year, the second year? So how many assessors, how many trades, how many air pumps do we need? What are the numbers involved, and how do we fulfill that? But I think it's a really good question. You're absolutely right, Michael, and I don't really have the answer, and I'm not sure any of us do. It is something that, I had a discussion today with someone who's heavily involved in this, and he said, you know what, we may as well just not bother, because we're not going to be able to achieve it. And that felt very defeatist. I said, no, we absolutely must do it. It is the right thing to do, but I don't have an answer, and I can't say, oh yes, we've got a plan to get it all done by 2035, even though that's our target. And I'm sorry if that's not.
Well, if I can respond to that, thank you for being brave and even attempting an answer to my question. I knew pretty much that it was impossible. But one thing that we do have some ability to control is the amount of resource which is sensibly applied. And what's prompted this remark is something I saw this morning, that Kensington and Chelsea Council in London have just let a contract for £6.54 million to refurbish a block of 32 flats, according to the Energy Sprong approach, which is a deep retrofit approach. That works out at £180,000 per dwelling. We cannot afford as a country, certainly not as a household, investment of anything like that for the very high proportion of the 29 million dwellings that we have to deal with. So we have to be realistic about what we're encouraging in terms of the degree of retrofit that we aim for. And we should certainly avoid the term deep retrofit if we don't mean it.
Right, I'll call this discussion to an end. Thank you, Michael. That's fantastic that there's, I personally think there may be a range, that you'll get some deep greens and you'll get people, a lot of people, hopefully the majority, who just simply go for heat pump ready homes. But let's move on, Denise, to the next phase. And it's great, because some of these are unanswerable questions. We are working in the dark. We've never had a climate emergency like this before.
Good points. Thank you for your comments, and I take them all on board. I do definitely see this as part of the process of understanding the problem and gathering those perspectives. If I can just share my screen again and move on to the next part of my presentation, which I was asked to talk about a one-stop shop, but I'm actually going to take a step back from a one-stop shop and talk about community engagement, because we've been accepted onto this local climate engagement programme, which will provide some training for local authority officers and a limited amount of training for our elected members, our councillors, on community engagement techniques. and it'll help us develop a plan for engaging with our communities in order to understand what's needed to help homeowners decarbonise their homes. And your comments and questions have already shown that you have probably a better understanding of this issue in many ways than the officers involved. And actually your perspectives therefore are, fundamental. So what we want to do is to understand all these and to actually develop a plan of how we're going to come forward, going to move forward with this decarbonisation. And I think we can sort of probably anticipate what some of the suggestions and thoughts might be on specific actions. But I'm guessing there will be other actions that we really haven't anticipated or thought about. So that's why it's necessary to understand what's needed, the best way forward. And I think Michael's raised a really important point is, what's the most efficient and effective way forward? We could deep retrofit 10 homes, but actually it might be better to sort of have a less deep retrofit of 80 homes, but that deals, that cuts more emissions overall and hits a bigger number of homes. So we will be then developing a plan in parallel with you as well to share this information, share all those discussions and agree the actions moving forward. So that's kind of the next step for that. And the potential actions, you probably already got a longer list than me, but potentially one thing that's been discussed by quite a few different groups around the county is having an impartial one-stop shop for retrofit. And there are other examples around the country of this. There are also lots or quite a few what I would term partial one-stop shops, where a specific company actually provides a one-stop shop, but actually then quite partial because they're selling their own products. So we can learn the lessons from other models around the country, but I do think it needs to be quite a local thing that's specific to Derbyshire, understanding who's working where, what's available and so on. Potential actions are about quality assurance, some simple practical advice and simple tips, from the having an assessment of your home so that some DIYers might be able to do it themselves and so on. Potentially some eco homes open days so that you can go and see an air source heat pump in action. What does it actually feel like and how noisy actually are they? Some facilitated discussions and lots more sort of potential actions. What we need to remember though is that not everyone is interested, and so the focus inevitably for those first few years is going to be on those early adopters. And not everybody can afford to take action, but maybe there are some really cheap actions that people still haven't taken that we can support individuals with. And also funding that is available will be limited. We're going to move on to this, aren't we, Zizi? But the council can seek funding to support but won't pay for retrofit measures, which I think is widely understood. So I think at that point, I'm going to stop sharing again because, cancel, there we go. I think if we pause again then to talk about that's a very brief sort of visit to that, but I don't want to preempt what people actually think is needed to help decarbonise, but I appreciate a one-stop shop, whether that's a virtual, rotate the one that moves around village halls, or whatever, to visit your locality. You don't actually have to go and visit them, that can provide a list of accredited trades and assessors and coordinators and so on. There's models around, but I think we need to discuss over a period of time with a number of groups and individuals how to move forward on that. Does that help?
Yes, I think that's very helpful. And it's raised lots of questions for me, but I'll let Peter start the questions for this section off.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just wanted to make the point about how at a local level it's really about building trust, I think, in steps in terms of using the tradespeople. I'm working with Sustainable Hayfield, and we're running a campaign on ways to reduce people's energy bills with very simple steps. And one of the things that we're thinking of offering is like a free draft proofing for doors. So if you get a workman to sort of install those for free, you're straight away building up a relationship with the people you're putting the draft proofing in for. It's not at any cost to the person having it fitted, and then you're establishing that relationship straight away. So I just wanted to make that comment, really, because I know there's a great fear around getting tradesmen in anyway, and it's very difficult for well, one of the hot potato issues of this is someone at a one-stop hub having a list of traders that they want to recommend, but that can always go wrong, I think, or it can always lead into problems. So I think the role of the community and the people putting the actual doing the retrofitting is really paramount.
Yes,
I think that,
sorry, Denise.
I was just going to say that's a really useful insight, and I think it's a really good point. So thank you. I hadn't thought of that before, but that sounds great. So thank you. Made a note.
Sheila.
Hello, Denise. I've got two questions really. I was wondering what the timescale was for you starting to work with communities and seeking ways of collaboration. And my second question is, you've mentioned several times about approaching communities and homeowners. I wondered what plans you have for approaching current tradespeople within the county to communicate to them the possibilities. And that's quite at the front of my mind at the moment, because a local plumber stopped me on the road 3 weeks ago and said, I'm fed up. I'm fitting gas boilers and I've done it, for X number of years. I'm so experienced. I don't know how I move into air source heat pumps, and every gas boiler I'm fitting now, I just feel it's wrong, but it's the meals on my family's table. And the thoughts of moving from one to the other, he said, I'll be honest, he said, I know I should be doing it, but I'm frightened.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question first, the timescales for starting to engage with communities, I definitely see these kinds of talks as being part of that. We will be undergoing our training with Shared Future and DEMSOC from April to July, and during that period we see working with communities as a kind of thing that's happening in parallel, if you like, to sort of, because during our 3-month process we're developing a detailed engagement plan, but again we need to work with communities to develop the engagement plan, to develop the work. So over the next 3 months, but I see that going on over the summer and not being a kind of a start and a finish, because I think it's an ongoing process, but definitely coming up with the way forward, certainly by the autumn, to have something very concrete. But things I think will happen as we go along as well. I think it's not kind of that's the end of phase 1, phase 2 starting or anything like that. I think it's, if there's something that we can start straight away that's an obvious thing, then we would do that. Contacting tradespeople. So our economic regen people have been working on this, and they do have routes through the Chamber of Commerce and through Midlands Energy Hub contacts, but I don't think that's reaching everybody. And I do think we probably need some sort of wider wider level of sort of promotion, if you like, because certainly if I think about my friend who I'm sure he won't mind me saying is about 50 years old, and his conversation, and in a very similar sort of discussion with the chap that you spoke to, and he was saying, well, do I carry on installing gas boilers? I think by the time I finished and doing the repairs, that would probably see me through to retirement, you know, but it doesn't feel right. But then being given the sort of £1,500 to go on a course, so while he's not earning while he's on the course, there's 2 courses he's going on, both about a week long, so they're quite meaty courses, if you like. They're for plumbers. While he's not earning while he's on the courses, he's not losing money in some ways because the course has been paid for. So he's actually decided to do that. He's going to the course and he's going to see whether he thinks that's going to work for him, given his age, given his previous experience and all the rest of it. And I think there's lessons to be learned from these individual case studies about how we can encourage people to take that leap. Because I think the awareness, as you know, increased exponentially over the last couple of years, and I think we're in a different place now, so I think we can move forward at a different pace.
Yes, and if the course is relevant, I do know somebody who installed a heat pump and they found that the contractor had done one of these short courses and it wasn't in depth enough, and he, as a homeowner, knew more about heat pumps than the person who was trying to install it and was just very frustrated. So I think you're right, it is about developing relevance. So Dave.
Oh, hi, everybody. Yeah, I just wondered if the council would have any sort of role in insurance, because a lot of the homeowners I talk about, I've read horror stories about external, internal insulation, roof insulation, where it's cost a lot of money to de-insulate and take out the bad fitment of equipment. I wondered who would, if anybody would stand that sort of insurance risk at any point.
We've talked, certainly within the council, we've talked about quality assurance, but people are really, as you can predict, insurance would be a different thing. And I don't know quite where we go on the insurance, because yes, we've all heard horror stories of condensation, you know, or whatever it is, causing severe problems. But I think it's a big issue. Why would someone spend, their life savings or whatever it is, and then have, such enormous problems? So I think it's something we're going to have to tackle, and it's something we will address. But I am fairly certain that our legal team will, just say, you must be joking, we're not insuring against that. But you'd like to think, I think it's something that we will, well, it is definitely something we'll raise with Midlands Energy Hub, who can take that back to BEIS and see where that gets us.
Yes, and the government's model is that it will be the retrofit coordinator's role to supervise the workman and sign off that the work's done correctly. However, what doesn't seem to have factored into the government's thinking is what happens to the people who can't afford a retrofit coordinator to see every stage of the work and wants to do it either DIY or directly with contractors themselves, because it's cheaper than paying somebody to supervise. So there is a potential way, but it's also got its complications, right? Again, I'll let you have the last question, Michael, before we move on.
Right, it's really following on the same theme. I'm from a generation where those people with a level of technical skills would maintain their own cars. In fact, I remember my wife strict instructions to me when our first child was expected to get the engine out of the spare bedroom. And our guides at that time, our Bibles at the time, were the Haynes motor manuals. So my question concerns DIY because, wouldn't you know, that same company has published, and you can see, a do-it-yourself guide to home insulation. So how do you view this as being a way perhaps of dealing with the shortage of construction industry capacity? And how would you see this fitting within a program which is influenced by the county?
I have to say, while I'm very familiar with the Haynes motor manuals, having owned a couple myself, I've not seen the Haynes home insulation one. So I will be tracking one of those down and hope it's as good as the vehicle ones, because they were always really good. But I think you're absolutely right. There's the getting a trade in to do something, and then there's the DIY and understanding. You know, I'm thinking about my husband. If he does something, you know, he spends that long researching it on the internet before he does it. He knows it inside out before he does something, and the pros and cons, you know. And if ever he was buying a new powered device, he would know all the different models, what the pros and cons of all those things were. And we probably need to be recognizing that need, but that needs to be kept up to date, if you like, doesn't it? Because all those things, you know, once you bought a Ford Escort Mark whatever it was, that's the car, isn't it? But actually, you know, retrofitting your home, each year there's new technologies that become available, if you like, or new materials or whatever. So it needs to be kept current, doesn't it? But it's definitely something to think about. So yeah, I don't have the answers, but I'll add it to the list.
Well, thank you. And now, are you up for doing the first bit of funding, and then I'll give Simon a few minutes to do the next section?
Yeah. And again, this is a very short, there's just one slide to share with you, which has more questions than answers in actual fact. So earlier on, I did talk about the lack of resources and a perceived lack of resources. I think it's important to anticipate positively that the government is going to provide some funding for retrofit, and we are seeing that. So I think it's in 2 or 3 days' time, the £5,000 grants for heat pumps and so on will become available to homeowners. And definitely the way, when we have updates from BEIS about the way that the government's thinking, heat from homes, in particular heat rather than energy use per se, but particularly heat, is a really key issue, and it's recognised as a really hard nut to crack. But I can anticipate, I think, that the government is going to be very much in favour of providing some grants and some funding for certain things. And I think we can use Midlands Energy Hub, which I don't know if you know, but the energy hubs are going to be rebranded as net zero hubs. And I think that's an interesting shift in kind of how they're perceived, from energy to net zero. I think that's very positive. But certainly Midlands Energy Hub is very supportive of looking at what opportunities are and what's needed. So I would definitely hope that Midlands Energy Hub would be able to support an initiative like this moving forward. But also other partners. So for instance, March's Energy Agency, and I know March's Energy Agency have sought external funding on behalf of the councils for other things like the warmer Derbyshire, warmer Derby and Derbyshire helpline. So sometimes local authorities can't access funding, whereas other organisations, CSCs or charities can. And the other thing I don't know if you're aware of is that Derbyshire has been, along with Nottingham City, Nottinghamshire and Derby City, we are one of the pathfinder groups for a new devolution deal looking at devolved powers. So we will still be, councils will still exist and so on, but we will effectively be a combined authority as I understand it, and it's very, very early days in these discussions. This announcement's very recent, but that will give certain powers and funding. And I know that climate change is sort of regarded as one of the key sort of actions as a sort of devolved authority, if you like, but that climate change action will be through all sorts of, it's not, climate change isn't going to be in this nice little neat bubble. It's going to be climate change within training, climate change within the economy. So it becomes part of how we live, not as a special little thing that works in isolation. So I think funding for some things will increasingly be available, but I don't think at any point, other than perhaps something like a £5,000 grant, at no point I can't see any funding being available to say, right, there's £20,000, off you go, retrofit your home. I don't think we'll ever get to that, and I don't think any of us really would expect that, really. What are the barriers? As Michael suggested earlier on, the speed of implementation, we're not going to get the speed of implementation we really need. We can only do our best with that. But I think because of that worry about the speed of implementation, I wonder whether it's better to focus on one or two key actions that we can then drive forward with greater speed. And I think that's where the engagement with communities comes from, to get that clarity about what we're all trying to achieve and know where we're going, so we're not faffing around, really. And I think another barrier is the coordination between different stakeholders. I think we need to all, and when I say stakeholders, it's communities, it's councils, it's Midlands Energy Hub, it's voluntary organisations, third sector organisations and so on. We need to be speaking with one voice to make that journey as smooth and efficient as possible. And I think that's where you can help, by ensuring that we get to speak with one voice. So that's the end of my input on that.
Right, I see, Steve, you've got your hand up, but I'm going to get Simon to do his bit of introduction first and then take questions on both. So Simon, over to you. We're not hearing you yet. We can see your shared screen.
There you are. Found the unmute button. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Just to say, yeah, really interesting. I've been taking lots of notes in the background. I hope that's okay, including tracking the questions and conversations that have been emerging. So I think you've asked me just to talk a little bit about some work that we're doing as Marches Energy Agency. This is over in the Marches, so it's Shropshire, Herefordshire and Powys. But just by way of explanation very quickly, there's been lots of mentions of MEA, and my colleague Pete is on the call this evening. Pete's running our Warmer Derby and Derbyshire work, it now in its third year, and is based in Belper with a team. Will's in Chesterfield, FICA is in Derby. So we have got a strong local presence in relation to this agenda. All of that works really around sort of fuel poverty and supporting struggling householders. And also we've got funding that we're using to help the 9 LAs across Derby and Derbyshire with the local authority delivery programme, which Denise has also mentioned. And again, I won't go into that, but really just to focus on the able to pay sector. As Zizi has pointed out in her note, we have managed to secure 60 quid under £500,000 to think about many of these questions in the context of Herefordshire, Shropshire and Powys. I am also having reasonably advanced conversations with Chesterfield NHS and also with Derby Uni about replicating a similar approach in Derby and Derbyshire. And we will be looking at bringing forward an application to the same fund for similar amounts. I'm hoping in July at some point with a fair wind behind us. So we're calling the project Building Retrofit in the Marches. And just very quickly to give you a feel for the partners, we've got 2 energy charities involved, ourselves as the lead, and then 7Y Energy Agency, who are covering Herefordshire and Powys. We've got 3 local authority partners, Shropshire, Herefordshire and Powys local authorities. We've created a technical panel involving local green building architects and building engineers. And we're also looking to develop that to include some air pressure testing expertise and some additional surveying capacity as well. And we've got 1, possibly 2 experts with an interest in older and historic buildings, which, given the makeup of our homes locally, is a really important consideration. We're also been talking this afternoon about local installers, and our intention is to be starting to map those out tomorrow. We have said we'll engage 20 in this journey, but we may well end up going to 50 or 60, depending upon what comes forward and who's interested in what we find. We have got a very strong community input. So there's a list of community groups. I won't go through them there, but we're looking for support from 6 local community groups. And I think that sense of feedback and lived experience, as well as promotion locally, are going to feel like the 2 key aspects where we'll be asking them to assist. And I've been making notes about asking them what they would like to see in future programs in terms of scaling up. So that's really interesting too from this evening for me. And we're including some national best practice. Parity projects, we've got their program builder tool, which is going to give us a cheaper modeling version. It's going to be an energy performance certificate, which you can then download and model. We're going to be buying a bit of time from Carbon Co-op. So Jonathan Atkinson is going to be helping us out, as are the Green Register in Bristol, who have an interesting program of future-proofing, they call it, which is a course designed for installers and contractors in this space. And we're going to be playing with green finance and working out how we're going to fund all of this, because as Denise mentions, there's not a snifter from the local authorities of wanting to pay for this. And I think that's probably rightly so at the current juncture. So we need to find mechanisms by which householders are prepared to invest, and the likes of the Ecology Building Society are really interesting. And also just over the border in Wales, I get very envious of a 0% loan scheme being run by a community bank there, which makes me cross and envious in equal measure. But hopefully we can try and influence English action around that in some way. Hopefully you can see this. I'll might just get rid of that. But this is just really designed to be a bit of a flow diagram of how we see all this working. So the bits in grey are the roles of the technical panel here towards the bottom. So we're looking to undertake some initial engagement and to have quick conversations with 350 householders, of whom 150 we're going to take into a survey process. And really we're looking to offer 4 approaches. One is the PAS 2035 that we've been talking about quite a lot already. One is a sort of green building architect level of expertise. One is a quick EPC phone conversation and then straight to an installer. And then as a program builder, which is a sort of a middle way house. So we're looking probably at 4 different levels of depth, depending upon householder aspiration and readiness and the difficulty of the property to be retrofitted in any meaningful way. So we're playing with all of this. These are just our thoughts. This is what we said we'd do to the funder. And we've now got 2 years of funding to work out how to make all this hang together and see if it actually works or not. So it's quite exciting, actually. After the survey, we're into some detailed planning, so technical surveys, costings, agreeing ventilation strategies, install measures. So of the 150 surveys we're looking to do, we are hoping that measures will be installed in 40. We're not providing any capital funding, but we have got a mix of householders coming forward into the programme. So we've got majority able to pay, but we've also included those who are unable to pay, and we're looking to fund those through a government central funded programme, and also those partially able to pay who effectively fall between both camps. And we expect different learning and experiences to come from all three types of householders. We're fed up at MEA of getting very little feedback on the work that we do, especially around capital funding measures. So we're trying to build in a significant chunk around this. So we're looking at some data gathering, perhaps some thermal imaging training and analysis, some air pressure testing, energy use, and then some subjective householders' experiences in relation to all of that. And I've mentioned community feedback as well. You know, what's the word on the street when we've gone, sort of thing, about how the whole process has gone. So we've got survey, design and planning, install, feedback, and that comes around hopefully in a virtuous circle to weave in for future delivery. I've mentioned the installer network already. I've spoken a little bit about green finance already. The other big chunk over here is around green skills and development. And again, I think, Denise, a bit like what you were talking about earlier, we're looking to understand perhaps what the options are and scope that out through a variety of avenues to see how we might start to seriously think about this at scale. So a quick example, quarter of a mile up the road from me is a company called Lime Green, who do a breathable internal and external wall insulation product. I've known of them for a long time, but in conversations with them in the last fortnight, I now understand that they provide training for a wood fiber EWI product. So, so they're in a position to be able to provide training locally. And a conversation actually only yesterday with a colleague on the project, she said that the Centre for Alternative Technology has got £20 million to be thinking about training and upskilling on a national basis. It's like, oh, great, fantastic. How do we get to be part of that? So top right-hand corner, then we've got local authority. We need to be engaging with them, and planning there is one of the key areas. There may well be other areas too, if I'm honest. And then what I really like about the funder and what they like about what we're trying to do is just that sense of scaling up. So Denise, you're talking about 340,000 homes across Derbyshire needing retrofit of some description. If you put a figure of 25k per home against that, some will be more, some will be less. Then you're looking at a multi-billion pound investment. And if we're serious about net zero, which we are, then we've got to get there pretty quickly. So whilst we're supporting a relatively small number of homes through this process, we want to learn from that. And the whole time we want to keep coming back to, how do we get this to scale? How do we get this to scale? How do we big this up? How do we make more of it? Because that just feels really important to us. So I think that'll probably do for the moment. There's lots more I could say, but I'm happy to take any questions or comment as appropriate, really.
Well, thank you. I think what is exciting about your work is that you are actually ahead of the curve compared to most people, and you are really trying out and finding out what works and what doesn't. And it will be interesting to see. So thank you for sharing some of what your plans are. Now, Steve, you've had your hand up for quite a while. What's your question?
It's a contribution about grants. But first, I'd just like to say something in support of two things Michael said. One was the need to prioritize and focus because of the enormous scale of the issue and how much money is involved. And the other is the importance of DIY. So I'm very supportive of his 2 points. The thing I wanted to say about grants is that in January, we did a survey of 675 people in the Hope Valley on energy. And of the 500 people who thought their homes needed better insulation, we asked them if the cost to insulate your home cost between 10 and 20k, how much grant would you need before you took it seriously, before you really considered doing it? And if there was no grant at all, only 10% of people would seriously consider spending 10 or 20k insulating their homes. If the grant was 25%, that number went up to 20% of people. If the grant was 50%, then 60% of people were interested. If the grant was 75%, then over 90% of people were keen. So a sort of break-even point is about 50% grant. And this is if the cost was 10 to 20k, which is sort of similar to the figure Simon was just quoting of 25k.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's lots of ifs and buts, because that was only asking about grants. And if you got a loan, or some of it was loan and some grant, there's all sorts of more complex questions, which your survey didn't go into the depth. But yeah, thank you for sharing your data, because it is interesting, just as a snapshot, isn't it? Shall I go straight on to Michael? And
why not? The dilemma for the householder, for the house owner, is uncertainty. Much of the investment required for any reasonable level of retrofit is not a good investment in terms of cost benefit, or at least it was until the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which has lifted the price of energy on the spot market very considerably and shortened those payback periods very, very considerably. But we don't know how long that situation will last, which just adds to the uncertainty. But the indications are that most investments, and I'll take rooftop PV installation as an example. Currently, the return on investment of that is 20 years plus, which pretty much equates to the lifetime you could expect out of the panel. So by the time you've got your payback, you've got to buy a new one. Except, of course, you won't be there in 20 years. I certainly won't be there in 20 years, but most people's ownership of a house, based on the average length of a mortgage, is nowhere near that either. So I wonder whether consideration has been given to a rather different view of this, and that is to think in terms of heat as a service, because the assets of the component parts, maybe PV panels aside, are longer than the interest of the person who might be going about installing it. So if the capital investment was put up by a company against the sale of the energy that comes from it, or the savings related to the savings that come from it, there may be a way through. Now, this probably works better when we think in terms of things being done at a community scale than the individual householder. But nevertheless, I think this is something that deserves some attention. And this notion that it needs to be done perhaps at a larger scale takes me back to Denise's point about local authority reorganisation. There are so many changes that are always happening. And I don't know, for example, whether this idea of a single authority covering Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire contains Nottingham and Derby as cities, because that really changed the complexion very differently. But out of all of that, this game of musical chairs has to stop, and it has to stop very soon. You have to get over this period of examining how we might go about it and actually delivering it. So Denise, what's your timescale? What's the target you have for saying, that's it, we've thought about this long enough, we start now? When is that now?
Good question. And if only it were up to me to decide when now was. One of my justifications for not having a citizens' assembly is we need to get onto the action as soon as possible. and specific actions, not just recognizing we need to do it, but how are we going to do it? Again, you know, that's up to my line managers and so on and so forth to come up with that. But I think that's where the community comes into this discussion, in terms of raising the profile of what needs to be done, and the fact that, you know, you're the voters, you want these things to be done, and we are there to, the council is there to serve. So I think there's definitely that role there. I can only say that we're going to, this is the start of the engagement process. But in terms of the first bit of insulation or the first whatever going on a house, I don't know. Within a year.
Oh, well, that would be really exciting if it was as soon as that, but because it does take, these things do take a long time to get up and running. But you know, we need to get things up and running within the year, so that's great.
I think within it, perhaps that's very optimistic, isn't it?
Well, possibly, but let's hope. I think unless you aim high, you're not going to get it. If you aim for 5 years, it will probably take 8, and if you aim for 1, you might take 18 months. You know, so it's good. I realise I should have perhaps framed this little bit. Presumably everybody's aware that there are bits of government money for people in fuel poverty, and that's all good, and hopefully that little triple will continue to trickle out and be good. But people in fuel poverty aren't going to be making the biggest contributions to climate change, because they're limited in how much energy they use simply because they are in poverty. It's the people who are able to pay often have the biggest homes and are making the biggest contribution to climate change, which is partly why I think that's the place to start. The other thing is that I'm imagining it at the moment, there's the able to pay, there's the people in fuel poverty, and we need to try and get the gap in between. There's no funding that Steve Platt talked about for these people who do it with some grant, but at the moment there isn't grants for this partial grant. It's either you're in fuel poverty and get your grant, or you're not and don't. So the funding, when I put this on funding on the agenda, it wasn't about the grants directly to homeowners. It was simply the funding for a local authority or a Marches Energy Agency scheme to get the whole thing off the ground. The people-powered retrofit in Manchester raised $750,000 just as working capital, and their business model looks at it taking 4 years for them to break even. So they needed that amount of money to see them through not just the first year, but the second, third, and into the fourth. And so with council strapped for cash, they don't have the upfront working capital. And so thinking about, well, how could funding happen was why I put this bit on the agenda. It wasn't to provide grants, it was to provide the working capital. And I perhaps didn't say that at the beginning. So if anybody needs to get up to speed, sorry, I should have said that the other way around. So does anybody have questions specifically about funding, or this is the chance to also just have more wider discussion and you know, discuss how we see it going forward generally. So Dave and then Jeremy.
Just I thought the Great Homes upgrade highly recommended the stamp duty changes, so that anybody who had a EPC of less than C paid a lot more stamp duty when they sold their house, and somebody with a higher EPC paid less stamp duty, and that would have an immediate impact on people's likelihood to fund the insulation. I just wondered whether that was considered to be a good idea.
So you're asking if people think that would be a good incentive?
Well, yes, yeah.
Okay, let's mull that. Jeremy, what's your
Thanks, Easy, and thanks to all the contributors. It's been a really interesting conversation. Just on that last point, I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think maybe we should bring it to the attention of Rishi Sunak when he does a statement via our MPs. I mean, you know, seriously, I think it's the kind of thing we could be lobbying for. So I have two questions. One on the funding side of that. And that relates to the recent statements from Sunak, in which I think I heard him say that VAT on home insulation products was being removed. Is that true? And if so, that surely is a good thing. And because I haven't found any independent verification of that. And the second question is really to Denise. You said that, if I understood correctly, you said you were looking to work with early adopters, and just could you elaborate on that? And just by way of background, we're about to, my family, my wife and I, are about to commence a whole house retrofit of a big stone solid built house in the Hope Valley at not a trivial expense, and we've had enormous difficulty finding contractors who will do it. But if we can be in any way a kind of useful exemplar as we go through the process, then be prepared to consider that.
Do you want to respond to that, Denise, or shall I go on to Simon?
Jeremy, we would love to use you as a guinea pig and observe what happens and learn from that. So that would be great. So yes, thank you. And that's really interesting because those types of homes are the most difficult ones, and people prepared to do the work are hard to find. So very interesting. And on the VAT, I've heard that. I noticed Simon's hand went up at the same time, so I don't know whether he can comment more. I haven't seen anything other than since Rishi Sunak's announcement, but maybe Simon can shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, the only other bit I've got is I believe it's materials only, and it is kicking in on the 1st of April, and I believe it's going to be in place for 5 years. So that's about the only other information I can probably add. So I'm actually on the cusp of buying some lambswool loft insulation, so I'm very glad I held off. So so I'll be getting 20% off, which is great. Never thought I'd thank a Tory Chancellor for anything, but there you are.
Well, thank you for that clarification. And it's really bad that it's only on the materials, because labour is generally the bigger part of a cost. And so connected with that, I'm going to come back to Dave about the Great Homes upgrade. I understood that that was a specific campaign until the budget, and the budget's now happened. So has the campaign finished, or
No, it will continue, and they'll be looking at the next budget.
Oh, okay. So it's just an ongoing campaign from now on.
No, the campaign will continue, and is being picked up by Friends of the Earth and a number of other groups. You know, they're hoping that the whole thing will start to snowball.
Oh, okay.
So, and they are working hard with communities throughout the country. So, yeah.
And I'll take this opportunity as chair to also share that in the Hope Valley, we've had a number of people who've already done some retrofit of their homes, and we're having these open homes once a year, although some homeowners are saying, actually, if anybody wants to come along in between the open days, they don't mind showing people around at other times. But that is specifically to share experience. And what we tried to do for every homeowner, not quite all of them did it, but quite a number, was produce a fact sheet that basically describes what was done. And then on the back at the bottom has the list of contractors actually used. Now, I'm living at the Quaker community, as many of you know, and we got Nick Parsons, who most of you know is the main person to give advice in our area. And he gave us the name of a contractor. We've got him to do various bits, but the last time I got in touch with him, he just said, my order book is completely full. I can't take any more work at the moment. So I think there's a particular shortage of people at the moment, partly or possibly mainly due to COVID, that people who used to spend a big chunk of money each year going on fancy foreign holidays haven't been able to do that. And so many of them have sort of had new bathrooms and whatever, not necessarily to do with climate change, but it does mean that there's a huge shortage of everything to do with building skills. When again, here in the Quaker community last October, we were looking to get some double glazing, and all the double glazing firms said we can't do it for 6 months. It will be next year, even if we quote now. And so it's just a particularly tight at the moment. Jeremy, have you got your hand up to come back in?
Yes, if I may. Another problem which we found in trying to get a contractor, which took me by surprise, was the uncertainty about the scale and of the work involved. And one of the contractors, who had been highly recommended actually by Nick Parsons, has finally declined to give us a quote, because he said it's just completely unpredictable how long the work will take. And he won't know until he actually starts doing it. Start knocking plaster off the wall and all that sort of stuff. And I can understand that in an old house, when all sorts of problems emerge that you don't know about. And coupled with that, uncertainty about the cost of materials. He says that the supply of wood fibre insulation, even lime plaster, is uncertain, and the cost quotes. You might get a quote for this week and it'll be different in a month's time. And when people are booking work in for 6 months hence, which they are, it's practically impossible to give anything like a reasonable quote. Now, I don't know what the answer is on that. I mean, I tried to have a conversation about risk sharing and so on and so forth, but that seems to be yet another complication when it comes to finding people who are prepared to take on this sort of work.
Yes, indeed. Michael.
It's a question to Denise. Denise, the study that you're embarking upon, the one funded by UK 100, concerned with public engagement, I do accept and have a lot of sympathy for your view that the equivalent of citizens' assemblies is not the way forward on that. But I'm interested to know how you do intend to target your engagements. I know that you're spending quite a lot of your time just now speaking to various groups like ourselves, and that is no doubt going to be very helpful. I hope this evening's will have proved to be very helpful. But we are not the public. And you could therefore get a very skewed impression of the enthusiasm we have for getting things done. So how do you propose to go about getting what you want out of the public?
I think that's absolutely right, and that is an issue for us. I think there's two things here for me that are important. One is, yes, the groups that I talk to all the time are definitely quite a small percentage, quite small portion of the population of Derbyshire, and they are a particular portion. I don't need to justify to you why you need to retrofit your home from a climate perspective. I don't even have to have that discussion with you, but the majority of the population, wouldn't recognize that. It might do it to save money and make their home more comfortable, but probably not bothered from a climate point of view so much. So I think there is a need to ensure that we engage representation across all the demographics and so on of the public. But then I think we can counter that slightly by saying, actually, if we're looking at the early adopters at this moment in time, the people that are going to be the early adopters are the people, by and large, that I am talking to. So I think it's not a fine line, but it's a sort of it's a bit of a grey area. But I think alongside all the engagement work we do, I think that engagement work will be that sort of empowering and that co-designing. But I think there will be an element of the informing and sharing information to start almost an information awareness campaign, if you like. So I think the engagement will be across that spectrum to reach all those different sort of segments of society. But I think actually, in terms of delivery of retrofit, I think it will be with those early adopters, which will be people like you, I think, by and large.
And if I can come back very briefly, what you described sounds very much like the business model of people-powered retrofit. So I do, if you haven't, I think you should have a conversation with Jonathan.
In fact, where I've got a lot of my information from is from conversations with people-powered retrofit. So yes, and the so yeah.
We used to describe it as keeping up with the Joneses. In other words, if you get the early adopters to do it, then people on the same street will want to know about it and will not want to be left behind. It's a model that works best for the context of people-powered retrofit, which is a more urban context. It's arguably a little bit more difficult to make that happen when you have a more diffuse.
And I think that's an interesting dimension, isn't it? Because most of the models that we hear about tend to be quite urban. There don't tend to be so many rural models.
And that's why I think Marchers, what the Marchers Energy Agency are doing in Marchers is really interesting, because it is a rural area similar to much of our county. Simon, let's bring you back in.
Yes, it is. It is very rural. So, I think give us 6 months or a year and we'll have some interesting observations, I suspect. A few more grey hairs, I imagine. Just to say, we do have a van that trundles around the place. Pete's got it on his front drive near home, in Belper. So, it's just really an offer that, if anybody wanted to help sort of gather a broader understanding of perspectives, I'd be very happy to offer that van. Pete's cursing me quietly now, for the collection of additional data in some respects, if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
That was it.
Yes, no, thank you. That is good, because yes, depending on where you park the van, you might, supposing it's, I think you came one year to our Apple Day, so people bringing apples to be pressed aren't necessarily on board with home insulation. So to just pop into your van, you're reaching a different crowd than the same old faces again. Does anybody else want to contribute at this point? It's not required, because we could move. Mike.
I don't know if this is the right point, but one of the questions I was interested in finding out about is people in private rented accommodation. They're paying the energy bills. The landlord isn't, but the landlord will be the one responsible for doing all the retrofits, insulation. So, is there much evidence that landlords are interested in this, or they say it's not their problem, it's the electricity bill is the tenant's responsibility, and and what is being done to address that?
There's some dates. They have to comply with a certain level when there's a change of tenant, and then retrofit for all tenants, whether or not they're moving, by a later date. But I don't have those figures in my mind. Denise, do you?
I don't know the dates, but there is it's called MEES, I think, but it's about the private rented sector and minimum energy standards for private rented sector. And funding has been made available through Midlands Energy Hub for Derbyshire. It's a district and borough function. So districts and boroughs are engaging with landlords. So the Royal We have a list of well, pretty much all. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, but all that we know about of rented properties that are EFs and Gs, EPCF and Gs, and those landlords are being contacted in the first instance to sort of so that they can be gently enforced in the first instance, and then they can be pushed a little harder if needed.
Okay, thank you.
But it's not something I'm involved in, but it's reassuring to know that that is happening.
And if you think about it, a home that's EF or G is going to, well, particularly G, is going to be one where they've never got round to even putting an inch or two of loft insulation in. So it's got some very, very low hanging fruit that many of us will have done many years ago, even if we've not done the deeper retrofit. Does that answer your question enough, Mike? As I say, none of us seem to know off the top of our head the dates, but it is a requirement of landlords that's coming in.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was up in the air or that was actually a definite legislation. So I'll probably try and find out a bit more about that.
Simon.
Yeah, I can't remember the MEES dates, but it's something like 2025, it's a band D, and 2030, it's a band C where practically possible, or something of that nature. I was just going to, private landlords are a bit of a mixed bunch, I've got to be honest. Sometimes they phone us up and they go, what funding have you got? We might say, well, you could get some EWI for 10 to 15K. And they go, great, that's exactly what I want. That's my MEES exemption, which is exactly what we don't want them to be saying. Other times we find tenants phone us up and go, we're really cold and miserable, but we don't want to send anything to landlord because we're frightened that he or she will kick us out. I'm thinking of another lady who actually a cancer patient, solid wall property, and we got to the point of lining up both an air source heat pump and some internal wall insulation. And then the dear old landlord said no to the air source heat pump, and they'd had coal heating, open fires, and the husband had cancer. So, you know, they're not a particularly pleasant bunch mostly, but sometimes they can do the right things. So that's just a few little vignettes off the top of my head. I know we're doing quite a lot of work some work in Derby City around that MEES project that Denise mentioned, and I'm just wondering if Pete, you want to say a few words about that if you're still with us. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hello. Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just trying to find the dates for you. Yeah, it's minimum energy efficiency standards is what it's called, MEES. And I think you're broadly right, Simon, from what you just recounted about dates. I think that broadly fits what I vaguely remember. So yeah, trying to get energy efficiency standards up to a D by about 2025, 30, I think. Yeah. But I think you're right that it might not be actually entirely cemented in law yet, that next step up from an E to a D. I've got a feeling it's not actually quite a commitment sort of sealed in the law as yet.
Oh, I hadn't realised that the whole thing was more proposal. This is the way governments work. They sort of make a big announcement like it's happening, and then it just stays as a proposal for countless great eons and never actually quite happens. Simon, do you have your hand up again? Or is it still up from last time? You're on mute. Or you seem to have frozen even. Well, I will then, if Simon unfreezes, we might let him have another word. But for the moment, I'll move us on to the next bit of the agenda, which is that's looking at the next steps. I suggested in the email that people might be willing to put their hand up at this point and engage. The one thing I didn't say in the email, which I should have perhaps, is that I'm certainly up for supporting, you know, I said it would be good to have 3 little teams. I'm certainly up for supporting each of the teams. I think there's so often in these projects start and then they fizzle out because there isn't anybody kind of holding the whole process as it goes through. So I'm certainly up for being that holding person, although I will be moving house this summer, possibly May or June. So that's going to be a big project in itself. Nevertheless, the 3 councils that we've got here are all at different stages. Derbyshire Dales already has having one-stop shops in its climate action plan, and the notes from the small group from the meeting last time identified various councillors to contact to engage a bit further and sort of nudge it along. Basically, our councils all have said they want to reach net zero by 2030, but none of them are moving at anything like the speed that was needed to get anywhere near that. So it is about nudging them along more quickly, even Derbyshire Dales, which has it in their plan. So who would be up for being part of a small team in Derbyshire Dales? Do we have anybody willing to commit this evening, or I can send an email around later? Wendy? Sheila? Fantastic, thank you. That's great. So I think, you know, sometimes a smaller team can be very effective. So thank you both. Then High Peak hasn't really got anywhere with thinking about this issue. It still hasn't properly finalised its climate action plan. It sort of got it through to meet its target and tick a box just before Christmas, but there was various input from an organisation called Antithesis and from community groups such as High Peak Green Network, and it hasn't incorporated those details into the action plan. It's also just had a climate action officer, Gillian Wright, appointed, and she's still getting her feet under the table. So it hasn't really been raised, and it hasn't really formed an opinion about whether a one-stop shop is an idea or not. So there's work to be done to just simply raise awareness with them and try and get them to agree to the idea. Anybody from High Peak willing to put their hand up at this point this evening? Joan, and where's Michael gone? Presumably you're Michael. So that's good that we've got, again, a couple of people plus me. And then finally, there's Moorlands, who have the hardest point because they've actually had anti from their councillors and the climate officer that just is antagonistic towards them. And that's, you know, there's that Irish saying, if I'm wanting to go to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. But yes, there's a lot of, Nigel, you've got your hand up. You're muted. I can see you speaking, but you're muted. You'll need to unmute.
It's not actually the officers, because we're going to be sharing officer. It's the
Indeed.
cabinet member. a cabinet member for climate change has refused to do anything, as far as I can see, except plant a few orchards. Mike could probably agree with me.
So there's you and Mike and, oh, the name's just gone. Your
Mark
other
Johnson.
colleague.
Mark.
Mark, that's it. And hopefully, you know, I'm happy to work with you and see if we can turn that around. The other organisation, which I think can be extremely useful in helping on ways to approach councils that are anti, is Hope for the Future. And they may be a resource that particularly is useful for your little group. Michael, I see you've got your hand up again.
I do. That's to ask Denise another difficult question. Denise, you will have deduced that we have placed the local authority at the centre of our attention here. I'm going to call upon you to use all of your diplomatic skills here. What is your expectation here? Would you expect from all of this, irrespective of whether the individual local or district authority decides to perform this role of a one-stop shop, either through its own employees trained up for that purpose, or employed or trained up for that purpose, or by acting through an agent, such as Archie's, for example, would you expect throughout Derbyshire, maybe under a unitary authority, Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, all of these districts and borough councils to be offering near identical arrangements? Or do you expect them to all be doing whatever it is that they choose to be doing?
I think this will be a one council approach, so that the way it seems to be sort of evolving at the moment is that the districts and boroughs are likely to remain focused on social housing, people in fuel poverty, and the private rented sector. And that will dovetail with work that I think that the county council will take a lead on, but there will be that kind of neat overlap somehow where we will take the lead on the sort of the owner occupied that don't fall into the other groups.
All right, so it's the owner occupied that we've seen, which is the 75% odd, that we have been very specifically focusing upon for the one-stop shop notion. So I return to the question then, slightly modified, and that is, should our efforts therefore be directed towards exercising some influence, such as we might have, on you, rather than our local council?
Or well, not necessarily Denise, because she's clearly on board, but the county councillors that we have.
I would actually suggest both district and borough and county council, because district and boroughs don't have the capacity, and in many senses it makes sense to have a county-wide or this sort of this regional, if you sort of the D2N2 sort of area, if you look at that. And I think this is still recorded, isn't it? And I just think that focusing on both the districts and boroughs and the county council, it's coming from all directions, and actually all those directions will feed into Vision Derbyshire. But if only the county council is hearing it and the districts and boroughs aren't hearing it, it won't have the same impact. Does that help?
I was being provocative, and I'm kind of recalling some of the conversation we had previously, which was not recorded, I assure you. And that, because it comes to an understanding of the dynamic between councillor and officer. Because quite frankly, we don't expect much of our councillors, because they are not as knowledgeable as the officers that they are working with. and they don't have the network that the officers have. So let's be honest. How do we...
Nevertheless, they surely have to make the decision, Michael. So we need to persuade them in principle, even if they don't have that detailed level of knowledge.
But we have to persuade them of something that their officers are prepared to deliver.
It is an interesting dynamic. And I think you're right. And I think the elected members are crucial because they have such influence, whereas I, as a sort of a lowly ranking officer in many ways, don't have that level of influence, whereas the elected members do.
The influence of the elected member is to agree or disagree with what's being put to them by the officers.
Yes. Yes.
So thank you. That's great. I'll move on to Mike and then Steve.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was going to say has just been taken there, but we've got the same situation in Stafford. Our county councillors in Staffordshire Moorlands, most of them are climate skeptics, which is unfortunate. And our county council is some distant place in Stafford that most people never go to. So we do have a closer relationship, for what it's worth, with our district council. But I'm very conscious that somehow we need to talk to our county council, which, to be honest, for a group like us is just overwhelming, to try and get our group to understand what the county council are doing. It's hard enough trying to find out what our district council is doing. With like, I looked on their web page today, and the climate action plan still says draft. So do I take what's been published as being true, or is it not? Is it a draft? Is it the final? So it's very difficult to know what it is they are doing, because, as we've touched on, they don't talk to us. They don't see why they should talk to us. They've refused to come to our energy fair at the weekend, as an example. It's just crazy. So it's really difficult.
It is, and I hadn't, because I'd perceived your council ahead of ours, I hadn't realised that your climate action is also still a draft, or at least on the website on paper. But yeah, who knows whether it really is or not, whether the website's simply out of date.
I've got the page up, and the word retrofitting is mentioned once in the plan.
Yeah, and that's the case with ours as well.
Yeah, it's probably the same.
Thanks. There's lots to clarify there. Steve.
Thank you, Zizi. Given the scale of the problem that you've outlined and Michael's pointed out, shouldn't we be directing our fire at national government rather than local government? Local government haven't got the resources. And my understanding, my thinking is that many householders, the majority of householders, will not take the actions necessary without grant funding to make insulation happen. Surely we should be directing our fire at national government. It's national policy to make this happen, but they're not putting the resources necessary to make it.
I think it's not an either or, it's both. We need to put our firepower into both. Certainly I write as many letters to Robert Largan as I have to any district councillor. So it's, yeah, I don't think it's either or. And the central government does have the money, but it's also dragging its feet and greenwashing the most. So to some extent, engaging with local councils is because local councils where the county or borough and district are more willing to actually get on with something rather than just make vague statements about 2050. Anyway, Sheila, let's bring you in. You've not said anything, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Well, just chipping in again, I just thought I'd throw this in as a positive at the end of the meeting. Plans have been going in Tidewell for a development of affordable housing. And I know this has been going on for far too many years. The last plan, there were a lot of objections to it, but our climate action group put in some objections about the energy sources for the properties. The new plans application is being submitted. There was a community consultation. All 21 properties will have air source heat pumps and photovoltaic panels. And I just think at whatever level it is, we just need to keep plugging away because decisions can be changed.
And, you know, to hear about the little projects that are actually happening, it is inspiring, isn't it? That's partly what our Eco Homes Day is about, is for people to actually visit homeowners that have done things and to get inspiration, as well as sharing tips and advice. We're coming up to near the end, so if you've got a quick comment, Michael, that would be great.
Okay, well, it's just to continue on from the point Stephen's made, and I agree with you, Zizi, that we have to engage with authority, big A, at all levels. I wrote recently to Kate Duffy, who's the head of the LADS program at Bayes, pointing out to her that the Bayes' heat and building strategy committed government to developing their public engagement scheme, which at the moment is only a telephone scheme, and try and learn from her what they are doing about that commitment in the heat and building strategy. And she's promised to get back to me to put me on to whichever of her colleagues could best address my inquiry. I haven't heard anything yet, and I think it's time to get back to her, and I'll let you know how I get on.
Yes, this is the other problem, that it's hard to sometimes get replies from that higher level, whereas local councillors seem easier to contact. Well, I think I'll wind up at this point. It's my pleasure as chair to thank our lovely speakers, Denise and Simon. And, you know, it's at one point I wondered, oh my goodness, I wonder if not everybody will have got much as background as me and whether they'll be finding this too technical, but actually it wasn't. It was really interesting and it was really great to have you both. And so thank you very, very much. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Oh, Mike's found the clapping hand symbol. Thank you. Oh, and other people too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Zizi. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night to all of you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.